We're lucky enough to have Henry Page with us today for a chat. Hi Henry. Thanks for joining us. Henry? Henry? Henry?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here and thank you for having me. Cheers.
I really wanted to ask you about what you think makes a Christmas carol and about how you approach the two wonderful pieces you've arranged for us. But I thought actually to start with I should probably ask you, what is a Christmas carol and how does that differentiate between a Christmas piece or a Christmas song?
I think if one goes back to the origin of what a carol is, inherently it is just a celebratory song with no inherent connection to Christmas. Its main meaning was to dance and to make merry, nothing to do with the church. With that in mind, we must be aware, I think, not to let it steep too much into religion and be aware of the physicality of it, the dance-like aspect, the celebratory aspect, and be that in connection to the winter solstice or the Christian festival. And I think that it's worth noting at the time when carols were popular in the secular context that church ensembles would have sung anthems and antiphons, whereas people would have sung carols. So it is deeply connected with the folk tradition.
I think that's really fascinating. So could you say that Christmas carols or carolling predates Christmas in Britain?
Carols, yes, are essentially pagan. They're songs performed to a circle and they've been indoctrinated by Christianity, as many traditions have been, and particularly associated with Christmas time. Though Easter carols are still sung in some places, and in fact, after the English Civil War, the Puritans forbade the practice of singing Christmas carols. Entertainment and religion were seen as mutually exclusive. Like Catholicism after the Reformation, they continued in secret in many places.
Illicit carol singing does sound quite fun. I actually went to a lecture last year which suggested that O Come All Ye Faithful was actually a secret Jacobean message. But the sound that we associate with Christmas carols, Henry, when could we pin that sound down to?
Well, despite the long history of carolling, the context and application of carols, the format that we're familiar with today, is surprisingly recent, although early forms of certain songs such as God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen and Good King Wenceslas can be found in earlier books. Their origin lies in the 16th century publication Pie Cantionis, as well as more recent collections that do obviously predate the tradition that we know today, such as Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern, which is a 19th century publication, and my personal favourite, which is the Oxford Carol Book, and that was 1928, so somewhat more recently.
So given this rich history, why does it so often feel like John Rusher and David Wilcox invented Christmas carolling? And why is it so hard to see past that? And perhaps more pertinently, what do you think the secret is to their success?
Yes, I think the influence of Wilcox and Rutter very much constitutes a two-part answer, really, and they have been obviously hugely instrumental in not so much just popularising the format as we know it today. I think a better word would be standardising. So standardising the format of the service of 9 lessons and carols, which we obviously most closely associate from being from King's College, Cambridge. It's actually interesting to note that originally the tradition started at Truro Cathedral in Cornwall, and this was the first appearance of a religious doctrine really capitalising on the tradition of carol singing, rather than the tradition being a secular pilgrimage, if you will, of people singing and moving from house to house.
Ah yes, I'd forgotten it originated at Truro. And then Kings adopted it after the Great War to sort of rejuvenate morale. And then the BBC started broadcasting from Kings in the 20s, just as Boris Ord took over, he of Adelaide Bounden. And of course Ord was succeeded by Wilcox, full circle.
We do really have David Wilcox to thank, though, for the standardisation of this service that brings and preserves and curates the oral tradition, but also But we really have to thank David Wilcox for the standardisation of the service that really preserves and curates this oral tradition, and also the legacy of Wilcox in the wonderful Carols for Choir books, which of course now number no fewer than 7. Rutter himself, actually, it's interesting to note, was commissioned by Wilcox in 1967 for the first Carols for Choirs book to write the Shepherd's Pipe Carol. And I think, obviously, that partnership heralded something very long, fruitful and impactful for the choral world. And I think it's hard to see past the smokescreen of this duo because of how prolific their output has been, be it with composing, arranging or adding descants. And the secret might be the ability to preserve simple melody. I think Rutter in particular keeps that dance-like aspect of the tradition alive, and many people consider that to be integral to the Christmas spirit.
So if preservation of a simple melody is key, why do modern composers so often try to recompose rather than arrange or reharmonise an existing tune?
I think contemporary composers, particularly those from a choral background, seek to recontextualise these timeless texts, be it something like Deck the Hall or Ding Dong Merrily on High, and provide it with a new colour, if not completely a different essence, to try and get audience to re-engage with them rather than just arbitrarily listening to the text or becoming desensitised. And obviously there's an aspect of not ego, but to impose one's idiosyncratic style onto a piece. And I think the dangers of rewriting rather than reharmonising is that it can fall out of favour more quickly and it can't be used congregationally, or at least not as quickly. The forces might vary more, it might be less standard, rather than the hymn-like carols that we may more.
Okay, so well, when you approach a carol, what is it that you focus on? Is it a sound, a narrative, a feeling?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I mean, when I think of where I start, it certainly depends on what I'm feeling in terms of the text and the style in general, but also the programmatic application of the carol, whether it's going to appear in a more anthemic antiphonal context within a Eucharist or a liturgy, or whether it's going to be in a carol concert or a traditional service of 9 lessons and carols. So I need to think that I need to think about application, but also I immediately need to know what I'm going to be looking at in terms of instrumentation, vocal forces, and so I know what I can play with and what practicalities and interplay with the voices I might have, and the timbral possibilities as well. I think I always start with trying to extrapolate the essence of the text I'm working with. Obviously in certain instances, if you're working with a translation of a text that may have been from Latin, there's obviously a number of colours, a number of essences that may be resultant from different translations. For instance, recently I was working on a commission that involved setting the 5th of the 7 Advent antiphons O Oriens, and I wanted it to be in English for the maximum engagement because it was having a programmatic context within a liturgy, and I wanted to bring out, because of course O Oriens means hail, gladdening light, or Jesus is the light of the world, and we translated it as O Morning Star, so I wanted to bring out that sense of luminosity, and I think I wanted to use the organ in a less inherently motivic, so sort of rhythmic or noodly or thematic idea, and try and bring a greater sense of light and texture to it. But it's a very difficult juxtaposition to have, I think. Narrative certainly is the key. It provides a great justification of structuring, and through the text you can work on providing ways that can subvert usual expectations with choral writing, and with the choral tradition thus far. I think a couple of good examples might be, for instance, in the Bleak Midwinter, the great balance there between the setting by Harold Darke, which is obviously more extensive. It brings out something new in the text, but obviously is for more extensive forces, so you can see immediately how that plays into the consideration of how it might be performed and where it might be performed, the forces required, as opposed to the more traditional Gustav Holst setting, which is much more hymn-like. And going back to the point I made earlier about new composers wanting to put their mark on a text and try and reinterpret it, if not provide a new essence but a slightly new angle. The Darke, although just as effective and more popular among many musicians, is a lot more challenging logistically than the Holst, which works to a very standard meter, is, as I say, very much like a hymn, is wonderfully humble, and is known all round all congregations, and is a sort of better known old tune.
You've mentioned dance, physicality, luminosity, melody, but what really, for you, captures Christmas in a carol?
Oh, that's a
which
difficult question.
Do you think sound the most
I mean,
Christmas?
it's hard because carols have such a variety of sound worlds, from the exciting, jubilant, rhythmic sounds of William Matthias's Sir Christmas to in the Bleak Midwinter again, or Warlock's Bethlehem Down. That wonderful sense of humble, sacred commitment. And again, this celebratory nature, congregational engagement is inherently Christmassy, but then so, of course, because of the Christmas story, is the vulnerable nature of the infant child. And I think as long as you pick one of the important essences, one of the important aspects of the narrative from the Christmas story, and bring it out and sufficiently engage with the text, then I think you'll successfully engage your talents in making a good piece, hopefully an effective piece, certainly. I suppose if we go back to the idea of carols being inherently dance-like and energised and having vivacity and being fun, then I suppose a motivic aspect or a melodic aspect is good, but fun rhythms, something that's essentially catchy, certainly that may be able to be reproduced easily by a congregation, and naughty harmonies, I think. Nothing overly difficult, but things that are a little bit scrunchy and unforgettable. I think everybody loves the rather left field harmonisations in the Descant verses by Wilcox of "Hark the herald angels sing, and O come all ye faithful." And in terms of instruments specifically, I think obviously the organ, that king of the instruments, because it's so inextricably a church instrument and heralds a big end of a service or beginning of a service, that has that grandeur. I think that feels very Christmassy, and especially whenever it has a registration, a setting of stops, an organisation of stops that's primarily festal. So to that extent as well, of course, the trumpet, and you think obviously of the association between angels and trumpets and the announcement of Jesus' coming, Jesus' birth. I think that's inherently Christmassy.
Henry, the first piece we've heard today that you arranged for us was Deck the Hall. What does this piece make you feel? What does the tune tell you that it's about? And maybe how does the narrative then contextualise that?
Well, I think Deck the Halls has a highly energised tune and a call and response quality, which emanates chiefly from the two-bar phrases, both themselves in groups of two. So you have deck the hall with bells of la 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 la. So it's two sets of two, and you very much feel like one side sings and the other side sings. It's very antiphonal. It's verb-based declaration as well, so it's energised and full of life. the dotted rhythms, and as I say, this hocketing, this pathing, the rhythmic material reinforces this, and there's a sense of youthful excitement in the whole carol, I think. The use of simple intervallic motifs, often moving by step, helps it to be easy to latch onto. It consolidates as well, I think, that sense of childlike enthusiasm. And I think in terms of trying to lead into that, I wanted to provide a fanfare-like prelude that very much welcomed the audience with energy and a declamatory voice. Obviously, the trumpet, which is one of the reasons I chose that. And so something very declamatory and announcing that this carol service, indeed this arrangement, was to start. But also I wanted to present something of the pastoral air with that as well.
Was this idea of the strings being pastoral born of their sound, or was it something extraneous you wanted to impart, such as the origins of the tune or the shepherds in the story?
I think the pastoral aspect was very much stylistically to do with juxtaposing character. I wanted the strings to have a different energy in the prelude material. There's still that dormant energy that fully realises itself when the voices enter, but the strings have a more sostenuto role when you start, as if they are fleshing out the landscape a little more, sort of providing that hyreth, the Welsh word for the sense of longing for home. So that almost, and I use anything connecting to being overly nationalistic advisedly. So let's say that patriotism where one longs for the homeland, and then that connection of traditional music and land. And going back to this idea of the trumpet being the declamatory instrument, I really obviously wanted to bring a sense of anticipation to its line and role. So I started with a sort of lontano intonation that gives that feeling of hark, I hear it upon the air, and that announcement that it is Christmas, that it's coming up. And I feel people very clearly identify with that orally, especially the sound of the trumpet doing that. And the combination of those two, the strings and the trumpet, feel very noble yet humble. And I think that references, it's in its sound world and material, the connection of carols to folk music, which is something I really want to bring across. And I think within that, obviously, there's that identification of land and music.
Which, of course, leads us nicely to the May Carol, a proper folk melody here.
Oh, absolutely. Very much so, indeed. And I love that the Oxford Carol book, once it came into more popular circulation, is chiefly populated by Ralph Vaughan Williams's harmonisations. And those themselves are very much based upon folk music that he heard from when he was a child. And of course, the man himself has stretched across the entire spectrum of English choral music, from festival anthems, SATB and organ, to parochial hymnal settings, to these folk song arrangements. And I feel that that's the childhood memories of English folk tunes, the combination of local ditties and childhood recollections, feels very Christmassy indeed. And there is a timeless reverberance to the tune, which Ralph Vaughan Williams harmonised for SATB. A lot of the tonic dominant movement, the simple bi-step lines, it makes it very easy to pick up. And there's also something of a stark quality to the E minor tonality, which I wanted to retain. And thanks to that aforementioned harmonisation and increased major minor ambiguity, which brings across that sense of mystery, rather in the lineage of, say, the Coventry Carol.
What was the impact of the text, and given the instruments you've chosen or given to use, what are you trying to reflect in that?
Well, I think a lot of the text features moments that seem applicable for specific voicings, and especially the ends of phrases and verses where I sought to continue the texture on from the last statements in the text to what would be picked up by the instruments. For instance, there's a fragility in verse 4 where mother dresses the Christmas tree. That's sort of dolce, but it's quite parochial and also timeless. There's a simplicity to it and a humbleness to it, and I thought the upper voices on their own suited this rather well. I thought the sparsity going into the Ts de Picardy in the strings, you'll hear the strings enter on this major chord at the end. I've instances in most verses where the verse will end in the minor key. This ends in the major, and there's that sense because the text or the words talk of the room being filled with light, and this major luminosity coming from nowhere I felt was very very apt for that. I was also lucky enough to be able to use a lute, which is a wonderful opportunity. I thought that really amplified that sense of timelessness as well as that of grace and fragility. By contrast, the third verse talks of the Son of God ruling in heaven again, and I liked the stoicism of male voices for that. I felt it had a certain, if not bluntness, a sort of uniform strength, and I set this against a simple cello counter melody, which I illuminated, if you will, with simple chords on the lute. Having the opportunity, I think, for such a range of instruments, the strings, the simple percussion, the lute, and the trumpet, really allowed to dig into the simplicity of the verse and provide old folk-like variations and deviations from the melody, and this was a real benefit. So the lute's language is obviously primarily chordal, just denoting certain points. The string language is quite pastoral. It sounds a little like Ray Vaughan Williams or Warlock at points, and the trumpet has maybe that slightly more grand festal air to it, and the opportunity to rearrange these certain points was another benefit of the timelessness of this simple folk-like melody, and hopefully the variations come across maybe in a slightly Mahlerian-esque context as a half-remembered melody, maybe that one was taught when young, coming across the air.
I couldn't agree more. I think these timeless ideas and sounds offer us a real sense of belonging and identity, which against any of our current backdrops offers us a real sense of comfort and perhaps commutivity as well. I think the two carols you've arranged capture that really marvellously, with an added sense of hope and maybe glitter. Thank you so much for talking to us today, Henry, and happy Christmas.
A very happy Christmas to you.